I am Jim Collison, and this is Gallup's Call to Coach, recorded on July 6th, 2022. Call to Coach is a resource for those who want to help others discover and use their strengths. We have Gallup experts and independent strengths coaches share tactics, insights, and strategies to help coaches maximize the talent of individuals, teams, and organizations around the world. If you're listening live on our live page and you'd love to join into the chat, there's a link right above me that'll take you there to YouTube. Sign into the chat, and we'd love to have your questions live. If you're listening after the fact, you can send us an email, coaching@gallup.com. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app to Call to Coach, or subscribe right there on YouTube so you never miss an episode. Dallis Fontenot is my guest today. Dallis puts her coaching skills to work daily as a senior vice president at ESI. She works with ESI executive management, providing information essentials in determining the best strategies for organizational growth while developing programs and resources necessary to implement the company's strategic plan. Dallis, that sounds super important. Dallis has worked at ESI for 23 years and has been involved in a variety of cross-functional teams, including marketing, business development, human resources, organizational development, and public relations, and is a Gallup-Certified Strengths Coach.
Yes.
Dallis, welcome back to Call to Coach.
Hey, thanks, Jim. I appreciate it.
So good to have you. It has been a while. I didn't go back, and I should have. I didn't go back and look to see. We were both a lot younger in those days. We had you on Call to Coach in the early days of this, and a lot has happened. So most people check out. In fact, let me read your top five. I forgot to do that. Dallas's top five: activator, positivity, restorative, ideation, and connectedness. That hasn't changed, but lots have changed since the last time I had you on. And for folks new to the podcast, give us a little bit about you. Tell us you from your version.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for having me on. This has been fun. It's been 7 years since I've been on Call to Coach. So yeah, there has been a lot that's happened since then. Well, just a quick timeline. I originally took strengths assessment in 2012. And then, of course, in true activator fashion, got everybody I knew to take the assessment as well. And then I ended up getting certified in 2014. Then was on you invited me to Call to Coach in 2015. And I did go back and just briefly watched our episode in 2015. And gosh, I was really surprised. I think at that time I was the corporate development manager for ESI, and we had 270 employees. Now, as a senior VP, we have over 850 employees. So we've grown a lot. I'll tell you one thing, leading in a company of 250 is very different than leading in a company of 850. So I feel like I'm in this growth mode always. So that's been really exciting.
Dallis, before you go on, flush that out a little bit more, because you breezed past that. But how is it different? How is 850? Because you'd think 250 to 850, okay, it's just 500 more people. But what is that physically? How is that physically harder? Or what kind of challenges have you seen in that, especially from a coaching perspective?
Oh, well, I think, I remember early on, just for me coaching others, I had the bandwidth to be able to get to most of the people that were interested in that one-on-one coaching. And now I have to set up other people and train other people to be those coaches to get to everybody. So it's really scaling, systematizing, making processes repeatable and scalable is really important. For me personally, I think as a corporate development manager, I was leading a team, and leading leaders is a lot different than leading teams, just a team. So learning that and figuring out what the cadence of communication needs to be in order to be executing and getting things done while helping everybody stay engaged and career pathing. The exciting part about it, though, is because we're in a company that is growing, there is a ton of opportunity for people for upward mobility, stretch assignments, and that type of thing.
As we were talking yesterday, kind of just in a pre-call conversation, you alluded to it a second ago about scaling. And as you think about the role of scaling out what you're doing at 250
Mm.
versus 850, what have you learned about how you build into other people? Because it can't just be you, right?
Oh,
You eventually you realize, oh, we got to get some other folks involved. What have you learned through that process of then versus now as far as building this into other people?
well, I think one lesson learned was, I think I had that high potential, that one person that, okay, that's an indicator that person's a strengths champion. And then you pour a lot of resources, and maybe that person then moves on.
Yeah.
And so then you're back at ground zero. So I think currently, I have probably 5 people that I'm pouring into to set them up to be trainers and coaches, and being able to have those. Kind of employee relations types of conversations, those coaching conversations with others. So we split that up based on role. So today, my role is very focused on directors level and above, so more of an executive coach, where the people that I'm raising up to be coaches are focused on various roles depending on which part of the organization that they're
Mm.
in. So,
Yeah, that gives I think that gives folks, we're trying to spend some time in this series with coaches who've been doing this for a while
yeah.
to these kind of lessons learned. And I think that gives folks a good progression, at least from a career progression of how that's changed for you. How have you changed personally through the growth in this experience? I mean, as you've looked inwardly at yourself and you do professional development for a living, you have to kind of
Mhm.
monitor your own. How have you grown
For
through the
sure.
process? Yeah. How have you grown?
Oh gosh, that feels like a long laundry list that I don't know that we'd have enough time for. So many lessons learned along the way. I mean, again, like leading leaders is different than leading a team. Um, I've learned the difference between, I've discovered my limits. There's something that happens when your strengths engage, and especially as someone with Woo in my top 10 and creating a network of people that I collaborate with or coach. We all have limits, and there's a capacity and a bandwidth that we have. And so I think over the last 3 years, I finally bumped up against, okay, I think I found my limit. And that forced me to rethink my current roles and responsibilities. What do I need to delegate? Who do I need to train up to take on more of what I was doing yesterday so I can do something different tomorrow? And so that usually comes with, in a company that's growing like this, that's almost forced upon you. It's not something well, it's not for me anyway. It's not something I said, okay, in 2 years, I'm going to reach my limit. And so I need to start. It usually comes from, this is not working anymore, and I need to do something different. But that's really exciting because it gives people opportunities to grow and learn and get their own stretch assignments,
Mhm.
take on new roles.
We kind of titled this as a road trip, and if a road trip of learning, right? And as you think of
Uh,
that in your own professional journey, 5, 6 years ago, you were in one location. You've made this road trip to a new location. What is that? If you were to give, a lot of, listen, you've had a career progression that's the envy of a lot of coaches. This is where they want to get to. Not all of them, you can't follow the same. I mean, everybody's road trip is unique.
yeah.
So what have you learned through this process if you were to give some advice on those some of the destinations you've been a part of on this road trip? What kind of advice would you give to coaches about how you got where you're at today?
Yeah, I think some of that we'll talk through these 5 critical components,
Mhm.
which were key. But what I would say, I just remember during, the certification process and the training, we talked about if you take 2 vehicles and you're going from Washington State to Florida, and someone's in an SUV and someone's in a convertible, they might take 2 different routes to the same destination.
Mm.
So I think for me is being less prescriptive. Hey, this worked for me. Surely it will work for you.
Mhm.
And do exactly what I did to get where I'm at. And there are a lot of variables in play, you know, and why I'm sitting in the seat I'm in today. And we'll talk about some of those, but really avoid trying to prescribe how to get to a certain place. But offering tools, offering information, offering, hey, here's what worked for me. And I think we talked about it in the pre-call of, my ideation restorative is just constantly generating possibilities for people. And so usually more than they can handle. So I always say, hey, here's a buffet of ideas to choose from that may or may not work for you. You decide which you want to draw from. Yeah. And so being tentative about that as opposed to really prescriptive.
I get this question all the time and I'm going to dive into these 5 critical, success factors as you would call them for you. But how important has it been, if you just reflect on ESI and their openness to this, how did that play in as maybe an early critical factor? Because you can't do any of these things if the organization's not supportive to it.
Absolutely.
So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think initially when I took the assessment, all of a sudden it was, oh my gosh, this could be so useful here. And I think I talked about it in the last call that, as we were growing, we were starting to feel less family, more corporate. And so had my eyes, I was on the lookout for something that could bring us back together, something that could facilitate dialogue, something that could get us all on the same page, that would help us be speaking the same language. And so once I took the assessment, it was really clear to me, oh my gosh, this could be something that could really help facilitate that. So, probably my first big stretch was, presenting to my boss, and before I asked, I went out and had 5 people take the assessment. And that back then we didn't have codes, right? It was, you bought the book and you ripped the code out of the back of the book. And so, these people paid for the book themselves. This was not a company mandated thing. And so they bought the book, and then 5 led to 10, led to 15. And then I knew once I had our president take it and we saw how accurate it was, then all of a sudden the momentum, it was that tipping point, it started creating a little bit of a movement. And one of my first stretches was, I'm going to go ask my boss if I can get certified. And, we've been working together for 23 years now. And so he knows me very well. Before he even knew my strengths, he said, okay, go get certified. But when you come back, I need you to pace yourself on rolling this thing out. And he knows me so well. And so, that became went and got certified and came back with a lot of tools that slowly and consistently over time, he bought in and invested in me getting certified. He did not buy off yet on, okay, here are all the programs you want to roll out. So we're just really intentional. We didn't want it to be a one-off or a fad or flavor of the month. So his support in me getting certified and having the freedom to be able to do what the organization needed at the time, and his support in me doing workshops outside of ESI have absolutely been monumental.
There's that saying, right? We always overestimate what can be done in a year and underestimate what can be done in 5, right? Or 10, right? And when you start thinking about the cumulative effect, somehow I've been doing this for 9 years and we have about 3,000 or 4,000 of these called to coaches that we've done. If you would have asked me that in the first year, I probably would have said no. Just so folks have context, what does ESI do? Can you just give us a quick explanation on that? Yeah.
So ESI is Idaho's largest privately held construction company. And so everything from high rises to grocery stores, tenant improvements. So we're a construction company. We do design build. So that's what we do. We get to build things and people.
Do you find, like, oftentimes, CliftonStrengths gets pigeonholed into maybe some professional development spaces or areas in your construction, maybe not the most traditional space. Has that been a challenge? Any different than you'd see anywhere else of using CliftonStrengths among a construction organization?
Well, originally I thought we had a lot of hesitation about, gosh, our superintendents make up the majority of our workforce, and they're out in the field and they're getting after it every day. And, these are hardworking kind of A-type personalities that are making things happen. And I think initially we were a little hesitant and skeptical, thinking, gosh, will they be willing to take this assessment where they have to, answer 178 questions and then get this report? But I will tell you, they've embraced it. Every new employee takes the assessment as part of our onboarding process. And I'm still doing workshops with them, and they embrace it. So I think it's a language they understand, and they appreciate what it does for the company.
Yeah, I love it because I think sometimes we think, oh, that org, fill in whatever that is. No, it's not gonna work there because we're different. I hear that all the time. We're
Yeah.
different. Well, so I love to hear when maybe non-traditional orgs where you think it may or may not be applicable, and you guys are just crushing it there with it. So apparently your pacing concept is resonating well with folks. Lisa says, I appreciate being told to pace myself slowly and consistently, and not necessarily is not necessarily my approach. And I think sometimes there's probably moments of speed where you need to go fast that are interrupted by longer periods of sustainability.
Yes.
Right. And that,
Yes.
so it's not always just slow. It's not always just fast, but knowing when to go slow and knowing when to go fast that are important. Arvita says, love that she's talking about pacing the org to roll it out. So I think that pacing concept is sitting well. Let's talk about now, coaches, and even if you're not a coach, this is a time when I want you to get a pen out, a piece of paper, your keyboard. There's going to be some real wisdom here. So I want you to make sure you get these success factors kind of written down. Dallis, the first one, create a roadmap. Let's talk a little bit about your first success factor of creating a roadmap.
Yeah, for sure. I think just to back up just this idea of a road trip, right? This road trip to a stronger you, titling it that on purpose, because to me, strengths development is more like a road trip, right, than a leisurely Sunday drive. And road trips are fun, positivity, adventurous, activators. So you can just see my strengths in action as I talk through this, but they're full of discovery and risk taking. And then they have the reward at arriving at a specific destination. So for me, CliftonStrengths was that key that really unlocked my talent. And so I've been on this 10-year adventure of discovering my strengths, other people's strengths, and helping to harness the power of them. I think that we can use some key business practices also in our strengths development. So we'll talk about that. So as I work through these 5 critical roles as an activator, I'm going to give you some action items. I can't not give action items. Really, I don't know that you're going to hear anything so profound and brand new, but really it's just some collective wisdom that I've gained through probably reading the last, 50 books over the last 10 years and studying and living through this experience of implementing strengths. So the roadmap part, the create a roadmap, I use a 10-10-10 rule. And so what I mean by that is the first 10, if you take your top 10 strengths and use that as a focus, and the second 10, I'll give you the quick overview and then I'll dive deeper. So 10-10-10, your top 10 strengths, answering the question that Donald Clifton asked, what do I do better than 10,000 other people? Second 10. Third 10 is then get to work and practice for 10,000 hours on that thing that those skills that on what you do best that will get you to mastery. So 10-10-10 rule. I've coached everybody from teenagers to CEOs and pretty much everything in between. And, some people have a real clear destination in mind. Someone's saying, I want to be able to go do this thing. So how do my strengths get there? But more often than not, people don't know where this destination is going. So my coaching advice has been, if that's you and you're at the early stages of strengths discovery, don't get so fixated on a position in a company and saying that's what I want to get to, because I'll tell you, The position that I have today did not exist a year ago. The last position that I had didn't exist 5 years ago. And the position before I had that didn't exist, 7 years ago. So sometimes we can box ourselves into a corner, but I want to challenge everybody to think very possibility minded. And so if we start with our strengths and we take our top 10 talents and be that talent scout, get really good at being the expert at your top 10. So then, we kind of go into that, the next 10,000, Dr. Clifton said, what do you do better than 10,000 other people? And just keep refining that. This is the part that might sting a little bit, but it's our responsibility to be that subject matter expert in our strengths. And sometimes I think what happens is we expect others to be that for us. Hey, I want maybe my boss and my manager should be the expert and tell me where I add value. And I would flip that and say, if your strengths are one definition of strengths are the things that energize you and weaknesses are the things that drain you. Who's a better expert to know what energizes you than you? Mm-hmm. And so I think we just have to be cautious to, as we try to answer that question, what do I do better than 10,000 other people? That's a journey of discovery in itself. And that doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen just from reading your report.
Dallis, how do you? Okay, that's great advice for you. Do you coach that? Because I think that applies. By the way, our embedded coaches that are listening to this is like all of a sudden, and Mark, who's now doing the transcription in the future. This is always great because I get to talk to Mark in the future.
Oh, nice.
Like this is the story for embedded coaches in a lot of ways. Not for our not necessarily excludes our independent coaches because they can find ways to make this, but you're embedded in an organization doing this for the organization every day. Are you teaching, because this same method applies to everybody, is
Mm-hmm.
this kind of the fundamental coaching method you're using for individuals as well?
Yeah, for sure. And we'll get to this ownership and accountability piece next, but first I'm training how to take ownership, how to be in that driver's seat. And then one thing I have people do is, hey, over the next 2 weeks, what I want you to do is I want you to journal where you were energized, and we call it the ABC buckets, right? What is your A bucket where you're energized and it's really getting you out of bed in the morning? What is that B bucket that's like, it doesn't bother me, but I don't mind doing it? And what are those C bucket tasks that really drain me and I have to work really hard to get to those things? Now, this isn't a license to say, hey, sorry, I got C bucket stuff in my job and I don't want to do that. But, as they make those discoveries and start paying attention to when their strengths become generative and they call what I call power up, what are you doing? Who are you talking to? What time of day is it? And helping them just really put that talent scout hat on to be their own an anthropologist, so to speak, of paying attention to how this shows up for them, because I can't do that for them. I mean, I can make observations, but really it's intrinsic. And so, it's okay to ask your boss or peers, hey, what do you see that I'm really good at? But being a talent scout for yourself is fundamental.
I love that, being a talent scout for yourself.
Right. Yeah.
I think super important. Before we move on to ownership, any other action items as we think about this 10-10-10 rule that you've found particularly important?
Yeah, I would say that third part. So just to recap, the first 10 is your top 10 talents. The second 10 is what do you do better than 10,000 others? And then the third is that talent times investment equals strength, which is get after it and invest 10,000 hours of practice. And so, I think part of that 10,000 hours of practice, what I've seen as an embedded coach is, I would say, alignment. So the action items with this are adopt this 10-10-10 approach to creating your strategic development plan. study talents. And just like on a road trip, if anybody's been on a road trip with kids, you're getting up at like, dark 30 because you want to hit the road early. And so they're still sleeping for the first couple of hours while you're on your road trip. So what I would say is, get up early and put in the work and consume as much information as you can. Most of my discovery happened at 5 a.m. Some people go to the gym, and I just went to work on absorbing as much information I can about strengths, my strengths, other people's strengths, my boss's strengths. What does he value? What does he need? Where can I be a complementary partner? And then I would say the alignment piece. Also, going back to the metaphor of this road trip, if you've ever driven a car that's out of alignment, it gets really wonky, and you let go of the steering wheel, and you're turning, and it's harder it's the resistance is there. So as you're working on this 10,000 hours of practice, think about what does the organization need from you, and then aim your talents at that. Sometimes what I see is people saying, well, here's what I do. How does this fit into the organization? And I would flip that and say, look around. What does your boss need? What do your peers need? What does the organization need? And how do my strengths align with that? Because that's where you're going to get added value.
I love that. And I often say, it's not just necessarily about what your skills and your talent, but there also needs to be opportunity. And that's what you're saying there. In the org, there has to be a need for that.
Yes.
Or you have to develop a need for it. You have to show the organization you need this. That's sometimes a little bit harder than filling a current role that is there. I mean, I got lucky with Called to Coach. There was this new program called, Certified Coach, training that they were going to do. And I had something to fill. How are we going to do this around the world, right? So I love that from an opportunity standpoint. Okay, we're going to run out of time if we don't go faster. So let's look at number 2 in taking the driver's seat.
Yeah, taking the driver's seat. And I would say ownership is the engine that drives you towards success. And I'll explain a little bit more in detail about that. So of all these 5 steps, I feel like this step is the most foundational in career success. There's an author, John Miller, who wrote QBQ. You can find more about him at qbq.com. I promise he's not paying me to say that. But he knows I'm a fan. I'm a super fan. And so his book describes these 2 pathways. So the first path the first path leads you towards success, solutions, creativity, results, growth, and resiliency. And I don't know about you, but I think, we're in a time where resiliency is becoming really important. So this path becomes really important. The other path leads you toward frustration, being stuck, blame, victim thinking. And so this first path his framework in the book is really easy. It's about asking yourself he calls QBQ questions, the right type of questions. And there's a construct or a framework around that. So these types of questions always start with what and how and contain the word I. Okay, so the second path where you're asking these more unproductive questions and that are leading you down to a not so great path always start with who and why. So let me give you a couple examples of what that might sound like from a strengths development. So incorrect questions might sound like, why doesn't my manager recognize my strengths? The correct question, their QBQ or productive question, would sound something like, what can I do to make my contribution worthy of recognition? Incorrect question, when will I get a raise? Correct question, what can I do to increase my impact? Incorrect question, this was guilty from the beginning, was before I took strengths. Why don't they value my ideas? The correct question, what can I do to build a business case for my ideas? Another correct question around that would be, what can I do to improve my communication for this idea? And so there's so much about us, but Henry Cloud talks about blame and this victim thinking as being the parking brake for development. He's another great leader. Carol Dweck talks in her of a growth mindset talks about this as being the difference between a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. And this shift going from why and the incorrect questions to a more accountable, taking charge, being in the driver's seat, asking productive questions is a really tough turn for people. And it requires a lot of courage. It requires a lot of humility, and it requires a lot of discipline, because most of the time those questions are happening in our head, and there's no one in there with us saying, hey, you're asking incorrect questions. And so what I find is if those that first path of asking great questions and keeping with the metaphor is like the on-ramp, right? That acceleration lane. Mm-hmm. The off-ramp, it's like you just took the exit ramp to development when you ask incorrect questions. And so this part is really, really key to success in strengths development.
What do you think? What's the barriers there for most people, or even in your own experience, as you think, what keeps us? So we know, say we know, we understand this. What blocks us from asking these questions, do you think, sometimes?
Well, I think two things come to mind. John Miller, one of the quotes he says is about how blaming others is a form of escapism that frees us from the responsibility to do the work. And, blame is easy. Complaining is easy. When we ask these right questions, it's going to require something of us. Mm-hmm. And it's going to require more work. It might require change. It might require a change of mindset. And I think people struggle with, doing the work. I mean, sometimes, doing the work is hard, and it requires, again, courage, humility, and discipline. And so I think that's part of it is, maybe a resistance to do that hard thing. And I think having the humility to think, gosh, I mean, just remember in my strengths journey, I pitched, a few of these ideas, and it's like this resistance to face reality. Mm-hmm. So for me, it was like, well, what if I need more credibility in order to be heard about that idea? Mm-hmm. What if I didn't provide enough information? What if I have a fatal flaw that's overshadowing this ideation that I need to work on before someone can actually see the value of ideation? And all of those questions require a long list of things for you to go do and get to work, that sometimes just blaming just feels easier. So,
mm-hmm.
Kind of a hard pill to swallow.
Yeah. Should we think about some action items around this? What kind of action would you have people take?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, go read QBQ. John Miller is going to describe this probably a lot better than I do. If you really want to double down on ownership mindset, Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin is a really great book. What I would say is, take the driver's seat and set to the side that it's someone else's responsibility to do this for you. This is something that you do. That's something you can do. And then I would say discipline yourself over the next couple of weeks. Just pay attention to where you see this kind of victim mentality, this asking the wrong questions sneak in, and just take a kind of a moral accountability of how you see this creeping into your thinking, and intentionally make the turn.
Love that. Let's look at number 3, and staying with the road trip metaphor, thinking about establishing mile markers.
Okay. Yeah. So this is mile markers, as we all know, on the interstate, help you determine the direction you're going or how much progress that you've made.
Depends on the state you're in, but yes.
Yeah. There's just kind of little milestones along the way. Companies develop KPIs, key performance indicators, that help us measure, our performance. Athletes measure speed, distance covered, heart rate responses, heart rate recovery. So then we pivot to strengths development. That gets a little bit more challenging to answer the question, how do I know if I'm getting better? How do I know I'm getting better at this thing? And so, as a runner, you have a stopwatch, right? And you can tell if you're running that mile faster or slower than the last time you did. And so I'll just take my positivity as an example. I'll just give you an example of how do we measure strengths development. I think we have to get a little bit more granular to see how this works. So positivity is my number 2 strength. Along this last 10 years, I recognize that my emotional response to what I perceived to be really negative or critical people was unproductive. And as an activator who hates wasting time, I was just frustrated by my own ability to navigate this space with people. And I felt like I was just wasting time. And I think everybody who's listening can relate to this. Have you ever had an encounter with somebody and then you just spend the next 3 days rehearsing in your head? I can't believe they said that. Oh, I wish I would have said this. Oh, next time this happens, I'm going to say that. Well, as long as we keep spending time doing that, we're just in this replay mode, we're wasting time. And so for me, I needed to, on the coaching theme cards, if you use those, positivity is I hate negative people who drain the life out of others. And so, I had to ask myself some really hard questions. And so in the spirit of personal accountability and ownership, I started asking myself these questions. What skills do I need in order to be more resilient? What's causing this emotional allergy? What can I do to be more of who I am and not violate my own values, like a positive person who lifts others up and doesn't tear them down? Because my response was just, I was tearing them down in my head and creating them as the villain in my story. How can I honor my own values and what is my part in this scenario? Those questions are going to require work. And so, what am I refusing not to see? Or is there am I not speaking my mind or developing boundaries? So I decided to make a goal to reduce the recovery time from trigger to recovery. And so I started measuring, like, okay, that one person came into my office and said that insensitive thing again. Oh, that was 3 days of going home, talking to my husband about it, rehearsing in my head.
Yeah.
And then it was, okay, what skills do I need to be able to do that better? So that 3 days went to 1 day, went to 4 hours, went to 1 hour. Wow. And I remember the day that person came into my office and said something, a real zinger that I perceived as a zinger, right? And perception is key word here. And it was like my heart rate did not even like miss a beat. It was just calm, cool waters. Along the way, I had been learning skills like crucial conversations and how to set boundaries and how to speak your mind and studying emotional intelligence. And a funny thing happened is I was getting so excited about my progress. I couldn't wait for them to come back in my office so I could see where I'm at. And so that person went from a villain in the story to being someone who was part of my growth journey, whether that was their intention or not.
Yeah, I love that concept. I've thought through that in other ways of where we take the negativity or the negative action in our lives and begin to build it in with positive results. So we begin to look forward to it. In other words, oh no, I'm anxious about, we'll say long drives. I'm anxious about long drives. Then you begin to do some things to overcome that. And eventually you get to the point where you're like, man, I can't wait to take this long drive because all these positive things are going to happen in the process. I love that. That's great.
And we need that kind of success, that those wins help us build momentum, right? So we can keep growing through the difficulty.
Yeah. How would you, as we think of some action items around that, this is where I think it starts to get really difficult, because you're asking people, I mean, you're really asking people to make change in this point. What kind of action items can they take to get started on this, do you think?
Well, I would say, establish some objective measurements. What is your objective and what are some key measurements along the way to answer this question. How do I know I'm getting better? How does my ideation know I'm getting better? How do I know my communication is getting better? And so, creating those objective measures, not I'm working really hard and I'm trying really hard, not looking at the activity, but looking at the result. And then benchmark your progress to provide that evidence that growth beyond just simple activity. Like for me, I was like, that was something I could measure. I could measure my recovery time to getting back to being productive. And then I would just say, restorative, I'm pretty hard on myself. And I think there are some other people out there that can relate to that. Just take some time to celebrate your progress. And how far you've come. Sometimes we get so focused on what we need to improve, we fail to look back and say, wow, we've come a long way.
I think some individuals get so focused on recognizing other people, which is great, by the way. That's awesome.
Yeah.
But I think we oftentimes have to take a step back when those great things happen for us and celebrate. However, we like Collisons like to go out to dinner. So we just had a significant event at my wife's work, and I was like, time to celebrate. Let's go, let's go get some dinner. And so a great way to do it. Let's think about, so I think, by the way, we could spend a whole hour just talking about number 3.
Yes.
In that, I think there's a lot packed in. Maybe I'll have to have you come back on at some point. We can talk through that in detail, because I think that's the pinnacle of these 5, by the way, and the hardest one to do in a lot of ways, just because it has so much packed into it, and it has to do with our own performance. I know, just as you talk about measuring my own performance, man, this is an area I struggle with a lot. It's like, how do I, with the craft of podcasting, how do I know I'm getting better at it? It's hard. It's hard to know those things. So not that I'm asking you to unpack that now, because that'd be like a whole year's worth of work in there. But let's look, and this is my favorite one of the 5. Let's talk about bringing others with you.
Okay. So I think everybody knows that, going on a road trip by yourself is not as fun as bringing people along with you, right? And I don't know have you ever noticed that you have the best conversations on road trips? Like, oh, there's some great conversations that are happening, or how fast time flies. How fast time flies when you're in that, having that great conversation. Next, 5 hours have gone by, and we're like, oh, that was a fast 5 hours. So the same is true on this road trip to the Stronger You, this strengths development road trip. Road trips are more about making connections with people and places, not just driving through as quickly as you can. So I have 3 resources that come to my mind when I think about this. So in strengths-based leadership, it says the most effective leaders surround themselves with the right people and maximize their team. So how do you decide who are the right people? Right? I mean, that's a question to answer. The second book is called The Proximity Principle by Ken Coleman. And he says the right people plus the right places plus the right practices create opportunity. Right people, right places, right practices create opportunity. And then he calls that the proximity principle. And then this third resource is Born to Build, actually, the Gallup book, Born to Build. And in that book is a resource called the Personal Board of Directors. And I found that to be such a helpful tool. I use it in coaching. So just real quickly, the roles that are mentioned in that, we all know, especially the coaches that everybody needs a coach. And these are people that encourage and motivate and facilitate your personal growth by helping develop talents. I have several coaches in my world. And side note on the coaches, some leaders are your coach, but they're very, those leaders, their coaching approach might be a little bit unorthodox. For example, if I told my boss today, the president of our company, hey, you're my coach, he would probably, he has competition number 1, so he'd probably make fun of me and just laugh it off a little bit and say, no, you just took initiative and that's why you're successful. He refuses to take credit for his part in my success, but his coaching style is providing real stretch assignments and as testing ground. And so it's a constant, here, go do this thing. And I have never done that thing before. And so if I'm going to take that on, I'm really in uncharted territory. And so that his way is much more kind of under the radar, but it's been massive in my own growth. So just know that not all coaches are going to sit down with you every 2 weeks or once a month and go through a formal coaching. Sometimes coaches come in all different shapes and sizes. The other roles are mentor. This is a person that has expertise in your area of interest, a role model, someone you look up to, an expert, someone who has specific knowledge, accountability partner. I think in the last at the last Call to Coach we did, I talked about my friend Candy, who is now, I just want to shout out to Candy because she just went through her certification process. And so she's been killing it. But she is, analytical, deliberative, strategic command mixed with individualization and relator. So if anybody's looking for an accountability coach, she is a genius at that. And then those complementary partners, people that have talents that you don't have. And then, of course, the other role they listen is person with shared interests. So as you're creating this personal board of directors, every quarter I go into a board meeting and people are sitting around the table and their full focus is about making ESI successful. And so what does your personal board of directors look like?
Dallis, how important do you think? Because I think some people go, yeah, I've got those, but they don't document it. How important is the process of going through, maybe documenting that so that you know for sure, or that you've told them they are? Do either of those matter in this process?
Yes, I would definitely say on like complementary partner, as we call, powerful partnerships. Someone needs to know if you're using them as a powerful partner, they need to know what their role is in the room. So our board of directors is comprised of people from different industries and different areas of expertise, and they know why they're in the room. They know what their value add is to that, in the room. And so, I think for sure people need to know, what does this relationship look like? And most of the time, these are mutually beneficial relationships. There's a give and take. This isn't just, I'm going to put a bunch of people in the room and use them up for what I need them for, but it's mutually beneficial. So yeah, for sure. And then if I could add 2 things to this board of directors that's not on here, there are 2 unlikely roles or characters in this story that you may not think belong there. The first is those you lead. So I believe those that you lead you can learn a lot from those that you lead. And what does their success say about your leadership? Are the people you leading succeeding? And what does that say about your leadership? Couple of quick success stories. Our office manager, as she made this shift from victim thinking to ownership thinking and really just harnessing the power of her strengths. It has been so cool. She went from, hey, you're taking my person, stop taking my person. And this revolving door around the front desk turned into her aligning her strengths with our mission and strategic objectives. And now that sounds like I've created what she calls it First Choice Academy, and I create ready now employees to be launched into the organization.
Wow.
And wow, what a cool shift, right? But that took some work on her part. And again, it took humility and courage, but it was a very cool shift.
But that goes back to what we said a little bit earlier about realigning expectations with what the opportunity is. And so seeing the goal was not to have someone come and be in that role forever, but the organization needed, it's almost like an onboarding technique.
Yeah, for
right?
sure.
In an organization of your size that works. We see that inside of Gallup all the time, where folks will start in one role, but then eventually we try to move them to another. Right. And it's a great way of onboarding, and they're not going to be there forever, but that takes a mind shift change in the manager to say, this isn't forever. I'm not building into them forever. And I think this is a mistake we make a lot, to say, because people aren't forever.
No. Right.
They're just not.
Yeah.
So what if we knew that? What if we started with the end in mind and we said, they're not going to be forever. Okay, how do I coach them then differently for the best outcome, knowing at some point my job is to move them on to the next great opportunity, right?
Absolutely. And she's been doing this for a little while now, so her mode of measurement is how ready now are they to go into that next place, and what can she do to teach them there. So she's measuring like how long it takes them to get trained up in that next position and trying to reduce that burden, say, to operations.
Do you think she's looking ahead for opportunities that might be there and then can fashion the current role in a way that would pre-develop them to be ready for that? Do you think that's happening?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
it's been so fun to watch her. So she's learning. She's becoming a strengths expert with who that person is, and they're having strengths conversations, so where she can say partner with them in a role that fits their strengths.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not just what is the next open position available, but it's where do you best fit into the organization.
Right.
Um,
How great starting that, seeing the end with the beginning in mind in that
exactly.
case, right? I mean, that's some pretty great foresight. What as we wrap this section, any other action items you'd have for folks?
Yeah, I would say that next unlikely role is the villain in your story. And
Mm.
so, everybody probably, there's likely a person right now that people could name that they're dealing with that are a little difficult. And that person might just be a contributor to your growth. Sometimes the critics are actually prodders, and cattle prods hurt, but they get us moving sometimes. And it's not always fun. It's not always, an enjoyable experience, but asking yourself the question, what can you learn about you as you're interacting with these folks? What can you learn from them? I believe Andy Stanley said there's a special trap for leaders that their favor is so desirable to those they lead, they'll pursue it by any means possible. And that leaders can be corrupted by surrounding themselves with people who are just telling them what they want to hear. And so if that's the case, you never hear the truth. And so I would say growing is painful. And if you're not experiencing a little bit of pain, you're probably not growing. So the action items for this section is go build your personal board of directors, not just those you like, but have a strategic purpose for everybody on that team. Find someone who shares your passion for strengths and enjoy the ride. Like for me, that's been Candy. And we've just had conversations about family and faith and community and work. And she's just been instrumental. And then embrace the possibility that the villain in your story might be a source for your growth, and lean into the discomfort.
That's easier said than done.
Yes.
Right. On that one. But it is so valuable when we begin to make that mind shift change to this difficulty will actually make me grow. Right.
Yes.
And
Yes.
let's separate that from harmful and hurtful relationships. Like
yes, for sure.
we need to separate that in this and have that caveat. But there are opportunities to grow in these kinds of things. And I just had an experience like this a week ago Friday, as I was trying to leave on vacation, and I bumped up against that situation, and it ended in me apologizing to individuals to say, you know what, I didn't handle that very well. That was a big growth moment for me, of just understanding like, oh, I need to be more present in these kinds of situations. So
right.
it's just, it's certainly measurable. The pain was measurable.
Right.
Let's take the last few minutes here and look at number 5. Take risks,
Okay.
go off road, and minimize the detours. Wait a minute.
Maximize. Yes.
The detours. Yeah.
Maximize the detours. So, just keeping with this kind of leaning into this discomfort thought, what if that thing, that hard thing, that scary thing that is right in front of you is not really an obstacle, but it's the very thing you need in order to grow, to get to that next level. The example that I explained earlier about the person coming into my office, I would get triggered. So my language changed from you triggered me to I got triggered. So that's on me to own and to work through. But that situation was training ground. So when I, as an SVP, a senior vice president, had to encounter more difficult conversations, working through a global pandemic and being on that task force and having much harder conversations, that became possible because I had this training ground. And I would say I would have never been equipped to have this conversation if I wouldn't have maximized the opportunity to practice crucial conversations at this level. There's a book called The Obstacle is the Way. There's a second book to that, Courage is Calling. And he has this quote, which I really think, summarizes this section. In life, it doesn't matter what happens to you or where you came from. It matters what you do with what happens and what you've been given. And the only way you'll do something spectacular is by using it all to your advantage. Detours can lead to discovering places we never knew we loved. There's a couple other quotes that I love that I share. Difficult roads often lead to beautiful destinations, and straight roads never make skilled drivers. So, if you're just driving straight, I mean, that doesn't really increase your skillfulness in driving, right? So there is, there's an element of risk taking here, because that next thing you're going to go do, whether it's going to having a crucial conversation or raising your hand for that next stretch assignment or giving away credit so someone else can shine, being vulnerable enough to be who you are, risking failure and looking foolish. Never let your lack of education, your lack of resources, or your current circumstances be an excuse not to accomplish something. And so maximizing, taking risks. The struggle you're in today could likely be developing the strength that you need for tomorrow. And so knowing not to run from it, but to embrace it and to lean into it, can be really a contributor to your success.
I equate this using the road trip metaphor to the kids saying, or maybe the adults, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet?
So true.
Are we there yet?"
Yeah.
Right.
That's so true. I'm writing that one down, Jim. That one's going in here.
Because we're not there, and we want to be at the end, but we're just not far enough along. And all of these things it's growth for us along the journey, and to realize we're not there yet, and that, hey, we've got, as you said, this one experience prepared you for the next. And I think sometimes we get a little impatient with the preparation phase and be like, no, I just want to get past this. Well, no, you actually need to learn it, because it's going to be important here in the future. And I've seen that in the last 10 years in my own career. I'd manage very differently today than I would 10 years ago, based on what I've learned about people. Right, makes me a better manager. Any actions, as we think about closing this up, any action items, any other action items you want to mention? By the way, that section was gold. You should just, if you're listening to this in the podcast or on YouTube, you should just go back and listen to it again. But any other action items?
Yeah, I would say, the three things that come to mind are develop that BHAG, right? That big, hairy, audacious goal that scares you a little bit. Share it with someone you trust, because it's not real until it's out there. What I would say is take one small step toward a goal you've been procrastinating about. Like, where are you losing traction? Where are you struggling right now to gain traction? And take one small step toward that. Sometimes I think we have, these big goals or this destination we want to get to, but creating little sprints in there can help us stay resilient, feel accomplished, and, keep the energy to keep going. And then I would just say, write down whatever the struggle you're facing right now, the hard thing that appears to be in your way. So write it down, the obstacle that feels in your way, and then make a list of reasons why that obstacle is really an opportunity. And so make that switch, flip that switch, make the turn that and your mindset to where this could be really opportunistic to you. And it's maybe not an obstacle. Maybe it's the very thing you need in order to get to that next place.
Dallis, there's been lots of questions about your 6 through 10. Lisa says, where's learner and input for you in your top 10? And or what is your 6 through 10?
Yeah, my learner and input's number 10, learner is number 11.
Yeah.
My 6 through 10 is communication, belief, woo, developer, and input.
And then Justin asked a really tactical question about, says Gallup studies show noticeable reductions in safety incidents in the workplace. As a construction company, has ESI seen any measured reduction in on-site safety incidents, or do you measure it that way, or does it play out that way?
I think the hard thing to tying strengths rollout to safety, but yes, we have. Matter of fact, we just celebrated at our last state of the company that we hit our safety goal, and that was 0 OSHA violations, a reduction in workers' comp. There's another mechanism of measurement, an RIR, and we hit our goal. And it was a focused effort on a relentless pursuit of safety that we're really proud of.
That's great. No, congratulations on that. Cher says it's been a fabulous with so many great nuggets. Thank you for doing that. And then you've inspired Catherine to go back and reread Born to Build.
Yeah.
And of course, you can get more information on that, gallup.com/builder, if you want to get more information. I think those exercises are still out there. That board of directors exercise is out there if you want to grab it from that as well. Dallis, thanks for listen, you put on a clinic today on how to be the best Called to Coach guest ever. Like, you gave me such a great outline and had really thought through the material, and you made this super easy. So thank you for all the work that you do as a coach. Thanks for all the work that you do in the community as well. And just thanks for a great session today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jim, for having me. Thanks, everyone.
Great to have you here. Hang on for 1 second. Let me just remind everyone to take full advantage of all the resources we talked about today. Many of them are available on gallup.com/CliftonStrengths. Of course, log in. All your reports are there. All that information is there. If you haven't been out to Gallup Access in a while, maybe today is the day you go back and see what's new. For coaching, master coaching, or become a Gallup-Certified Strengths Coach, like Dallis is, you can get more information on that. Send us an email, coaching@gallup.com. We'll get you set up with someone to talk about that. Find us on Facebook, facebook.com/group/called-to-coach is the group where we kind of all meet and talk about this stuff. And we want to thank you for listening today. If you've joined us live, extra special thanks for you guys, and appreciate you guys in what you do when we come out here in live. With that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.